a typical entrepreneur that we work with at the Incubator, if they had 15,000 extra, they would go to a conference or maybe do some more patent research or
work on a technology more.
Something more, right? Their technology.
But nothing to do with sales.
Exactly. They were like, we need to sell this thing and launch it.
Right.
So what can we do for 15,000? And so ultimately they made a video, the product, made a website, and got it launched.
Yeah.
So that was impressive.
Welcome to The Unconventional Path, Secrets to Igniting Your Business with Bela and Mike. I'm Bela Musitz, the David D. Ray Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Clarkson University in upstate New York.
And I'm Mike Wasserman, Professor of International Management at the University of Applied Sciences in Münster, Germany.
This podcast is about conversations with successful entrepreneurs you've never heard of, who have built successful businesses you have never heard of. Businesses and entrepreneurs that we can all identify with.
In each episode, I think we try to capture and share the essence of how interesting people often take unconventional paths to build their businesses. So we decided to interview a wide range of business people that have found and taken unconventional paths in their careers. And what we hope to do is capture some lessons, advice, inspiration that'll help you attain your entrepreneurial goals. So join us for interesting conversations and discussions with what we think are really inspiring guests on how you can ignite your business by exploring some of the many less traveled, unconventional paths that lie ahead.
Our podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, TuneIn, Radio Public, and Acast, and probably any other podcast system where you download your podcast from. So if you like the podcast, please tell your friends and give us a review on your favorite podcasting application. If you have suggestions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Please send us an email at bela.and.mike@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Hello, this is Bela Musitz, and my colleague Mike is with us as well. Today, we're going to talk about Simon Balint, who had a great, interesting story, who took a very non-conventional path. I think it's going to be a wonderful interview. What did you think, Mike?
This was great. I thought Simon had a lot of interesting stories to tell. I thought this whole idea, or this is something I think that people should pay attention to, is here's somebody who calls himself risk averse, yet he's had this really cool unconventional career path. And he had some really interesting ways to make it happen. So I think the takeaways from this will be really interesting for people that if you say, oh, I'm risk averse, how can you still make a really interesting career for yourself regardless of that intuition? You'll actually, I think, not to give away too much, but you'll find out that being risk averse can actually help you take more risks.
I agree. I thought he had some great points, and we'll listen to the interview in a second. And before we dive into it, just wanted to thank our two institutions, Clarkson University and Münster in Germany, for their support for this podcast. And if you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to email them to us at bela.and.mike@gmail.com. And of course, leave us a nice, favorable review in your favorite podcasting system. That's very helpful. So let's dive right into Simon, and we'll see you at the end of his interview for some further discussion. Hello. Today, I'm here with Simon Balint, who's a very successful entrepreneur, a person that I've known for 20 plus years, and someone that has a great story to tell. So welcome, Simon.
Hey, Bela.
So let's go back to the early years. So any history of entrepreneurship in your family or relatives or your...
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting question. At first glance, I think you might say no, in that, so my family is pretty small. It's my parents, and then I would include both sets of grandparents because we all lived here locally in the Albany area. My parents had me when I was quite young, so my grandmother just passed away a couple months ago. I'm 45. So they were all kind of part of my family, and if you were to describe them, I think you would say they're academic. Both my grandfathers were doctors, successful doctors. Actually, at one time, my one grandfather was chief of medicine at the one big hospital, and my other grandfather was chief of medicine at the other big hospital. And both grandmothers actually were professional. One was a doctor herself, and the other was a pharmacist. And then my parents were teachers. My father became a professor ultimately. So it doesn't seem very entrepreneurial. But if you think about it a little bit more, I think maybe not entrepreneurial, but certainly they were non-conventional. And that was part of my upbringing. So if you look at my grandparents, my father's side, my grandfather was a doctor, but he grew up in Hungary. He left Hungary as a refugee just before World War II and went to England, where he went to med school. And that's where he met my grandmother, who was actually one of 6 women who were the first class of women at Cambridge med school. She was from a pretty aristocratic Anglo-Saxon family, where typically the daughter would marry some other aristocratic Anglo-Saxon family. But she wanted to join the Navy, she told me. That was her dream. And it turned out that the British didn't allow women in the Navy. So the next choice was to be a doctor. And she went to med school, which in and of itself was kind of strange. And then she married a Hungarian Jew refugee, which is kind of strange. And they came to America. So there's lots of stories like that about my grandparents, my parents. Yeah, they were professionals. They were, well educated, but they bought a hobby farm when I was 2, and I grew up on a small farm. So I weren't necessarily doing the normal thing for a person of their generation. So I think that was kind of a bit of the background in terms of my family that maybe led me to sort of try new things and take some risks early on.
Yeah. Someone once described to me being a refugee, leaving everything behind in a country, is sort of like the ultimate in entrepreneurship, because you're just risking everything, right? People talk about risk, can I leave my job?
Yeah.
Well, as a refugee, leaving your whole life
Yep.
in search of some new opportunity, that, it's the ultimate risk.
Absolutely.
Growing up, did you have any entrepreneurial leanings? Like, did you mow lawns or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I always worked, always did something, for sure. So we were on this like hobby farm. So certainly there were, chores related to that when we were little. And it was an old house. It was like built in 1813, and it was falling down. So my parents rebuilt the house room by room, and then when I was a kid, like 6 or 7 or 8, I would help them do that. When I was maybe 10 or 11, I started doing like the farm stands and grew pumpkins, and I convinced some neighbor to let me pick all the plums he had and the pears on his yard, and then I went and sold them. So stuff like that.
Yeah. So that's early entrepreneurial.
I was always doing that, later that. Yeah.
Understanding the value of hard work and cash.
Yeah, I don't know if it was part of it was the way people were back in the 70s and 80s. Kids didn't just get money. At least I never got money from my parents.
Allowance.
There's no allowance. You had to earn it. You had to get it. So I was always trying to do something.
Yeah. I can remember as a kid, the big thing in my day was babysitting. Watch other little kids. And I remember it was like 50 cents an hour, maybe 75 if you did it for, a few families in the neighborhood. And I figured out that I could mow lawns and make like $2 an hour instead of 50 cents an hour. And so I was like mowing lawns. It was like just, made no sense. And plus the lawn never talked back and did everything I wanted it to.
Yeah.
So cool. So I remember when we first met, one of the things I learned about you was that after you graduated high school, you went on a little trip.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that trip?
Yeah, I graduated from high school. I was the youngest one in my class. I didn't skip a grade, but I started early, and I was about a year younger than most kids. So somewhere along the line, I got this idea that when I graduated, and if I got into college, I could defer for a year, and it would be like a bonus year because I was already young, and then I could just do something. So I did that. I got into college and wrote them a letter in April of my senior year and said, hey, I want to take a year off. At the time, this was 1989, 1990, so the Eastern European countries were sort of opening up, and the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed yet, but was kind of changing, and that was pretty dramatic for me. So I think I wrote them a letter saying I wanted to experience that, and they said, sure, go ahead. So that's kind of about as far as I had planned it initially, and I worked that summer after my senior year blacktopping, made about $3,000, which was my goal. And then I took a one-way flight to England. And I basically spent a year, so 12 months, backpacking through Europe and North Africa, Soviet Union, China, Hong Kong, Japan, and then I flew back home 2 days before my orientation started at college.
Wow.
So
Literally backpacking.
yeah. This was I literally had a backpack and a tent. I hiked a lot. I hitchhiked a lot. I caught trains and buses. It was all overland, so it was probably 30,000 miles or so. I just went by myself. I initially had talked with a friend about going, and he bailed on me, a couple months before. Remember, this is 1990, so certainly before the internet and before texting and emails. So you definitely were out there on your own. If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to buy a book to learn about it or talk to somebody you met. You couldn't search TripAdvisor for the best places to go.
Right. What gives a 16, 17-year-old young man the courage to say, I'm going to do that alone? Yeah. Not even with another person.
I don't exactly know. And when I think about myself, I think of myself as being kind of cautious, being sort of risk averse. But I've had a couple of opportunities recently to sort of speak to alumni or speak to classes and tell a little bit of my story. And when I get done, people usually come up and say, wow, how'd you do all that? And obviously you've got no fear. And so from other people's perspective, I guess it was courageous. I didn't see it that way. I think part of it was, as I mentioned a little bit, my parents and my family members were unconventional. So this was sort of okay. And again, my grandfather was a refugee, and I sort of had those stories. The other thing that I think happened, and I've done this several times, is that if I want to do something, I will plan to some extent. I mean, I'll think about it. I'll do a little bit of research, but I don't get hung up in that. And I sort of will force myself into the next step by basically just starting. And then that makes you take the next step. And there's lots of examples of that, including starting the business. You and I recently went sailing, and to some extent that was part of the experience. I mean, I did a little research. I looked at some boats, but ultimately I just bought a boat, because then now you have to take the next step.
Right.
I had this idea of going to Europe, but ultimately what it was is I said, okay, once I make $3,000, I'm going to quit my job, and then I'm going to buy a ticket and go to England. And that all happened within 3 days. Mm-hmm. And I didn't let myself think too much about it. I just did it. And now I'm in London by myself, and you got to take the next step.
And most of those things are not really as hard as you thought they would be.
The starting is always the hardest part of anything.
That's what I mean. Once you take that first step.
Absolutely.
Second step's easier than the first one.
Absolutely. And sometimes I would actually intentionally get myself in situations where I had to go forward. You couldn't go back. And, we don't have enough time for all these stories, but I wanted to go to the Soviet Union. It was still a country back then, and Americans weren't allowed to go. And I was able to figure out a way to get myself into the Soviet Union and not get out. I didn't have a plan to get out, but I figured once I'm in, they're going to get me out of there. They don't want me there. They don't want me there. So they're going to get me out. And that was basically my sort of plan. Right. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm foolhardy or I don't think things through. But I think in life, and certainly in business, and certainly in the startup business, you can get paralyzed with the fear of the unknown or paralyzed with analysis. To some extent, you just got to start. And if you start and make a mistake, you can then correct. But if you don't ever try anything, you don't get anywhere.
Because you actually learn so much more by doing than you ever learn by reading or thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly. You can analyze anything to death. Yeah. So I think it's sort of a common thread in my life, is I've often done that. And then what that means is whether it's quitting a job or starting a new business or traveling around the world or whatever, you just gotta give it a shot.
So you take this backpacking trip around the world as a young lad. So now that it's a number of years later, what key things did you learn from that have served you well in the rest of your life here?
I mean, you grow up fast. In my case, I was 17, and you grow up, meaning you need to become independent quickly. You need to know who you are pretty quickly. That was an important thing for me. I think if you look at every culture and tradition, they have built into their culture this concept of the Odyssey. The young person who goes away and goes through a number of highs and lows and then comes back as a better person, right? And so Homer wrote about that.
Right.
In a way, that's what college is. It's a very protected Odyssey, and it's gotten more so than when you went to school and when I went to school. nice dorm rooms and, air conditioning and all that. But that's basically what it is, right? You send kids away. We kind of set some boundaries so that hopefully they come back in one piece. But they need to sort of fend for themselves and go through some ups and downs and come back. And so that was, for me, my odyssey. Certainly it wasn't all fun and games. It was, really hard. A lot of it being alone, trying to figure out why you're doing it, trying to find food sometimes, trying to bribe your way into a country, trying to bribe your way out of a country. So I think that independence, another thing that I guess I learned was, again, sort of this grounding in who you are, and that you can then take on different roles if you want. You can try new things, and you can always come back to who you are. I think sometimes when people get in a career for a long time, or in a certain way of life for a long time, they maybe mistakenly merge their occupation with who they are as themselves, and that makes it very difficult to then change your career. Separate, right? It's you are a lawyer.
You got to get a divorce to separate.
Yeah, in some cases you do, right?
Right.
Whereas if you have a real clear sense of kind of who you are and that the world's around you, and you can kind of dabble in that world in different ways, different times, and do different things, and always come back to who you are. I think that gives you a lot of, it gives you a lot of strength.
Sounds like it also gives you a lot of, maybe another way of saying what you're saying is it gives you a lot of self-confidence in your ability to do things and to do a wide variety of things.
Yeah, I think so. I don't see myself as being very confident. I see myself as sort of always worried and anxious and stuff like that. But nothing has ever been as hard as that experience. It wasn't all bad, of course. It was really good, but nothing was as challenging as that.
Right. Excellent. So after your trip around the world, you go to college.
Yeah. So I went to Brown University, which is a little not unconventional, and so my degree was East Asian Studies, which is kind of related to international relations.
Yeah. And then after college, what did you do?
I went to Japan. Again, to put things in context, early '90s. The buzz was the growth of Asia, East Asia, emerging, Asian economies. So I thought that, would be interesting to be a part of. So I had studied East Asian studies. Japanese was my focus. And when I graduated, I went to Japan with the idea of going there maybe for a year to really, hone in my Japanese language skills, make some connections, and then, start a career.
And what did you do in Japan?
I started out teaching English. So that's kind of the easy way to get to Japan as an American. So I worked for it was a private but pretty high growth company that was teaching foreign languages. Yeah, I was an English teacher, but it was a growing company. We were actually expanding at the time, adding about a school a week. So within 6 months, I was the head of a school, and then I started a new school, and then ended up moving into their head office, which is all Japanese staff, and I ran their, I guess you call it like their real estate group. So as I mentioned, we were adding a school a week, and every time we added a school, we needed to hire 10 or 12 teachers, and we needed a place for those are foreign national teachers, a place for them to stay. So we would rent or buy apartments nearby and furnish them and provide a place for these expats to live.
Okay.
So my job was to go out and identify these properties. Typically, I had to meet with not just the agents, but the police, the local council, because some of these were fairly rural areas, and convince them that it was okay to rent to foreign nationals, and if there's any problems, you could call me. Mm-hmm. I would solve it. So I did that. The company actually went public about 3 years after I was there, and then we got into all sorts of things once we had more money. So we got into like international trade and business education and some banking and all sorts of stuff.
So how many years total were you in Japan?
4 years.
4 years, and you came back to the States.
Yep.
Back to upstate New York?
Yeah, my son was actually born in Japan. It sort of made me think about coming back to the Albany area, which I did. I saved up some money while I was in Japan, so I spent a little time looking around for some work, and then ended up getting a job at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute at their Incubator program.
And that's where you and I met.
It is. You
right?
hired me.
Right. We worked together for a number of years. So what was it like working in a university-based incubator? What kind of stuff did you do there?
It was great. Basically, you're working around a bunch of smart people. So the incubator was on campus, and we physically housed a couple dozen startup companies. Many of them were spin-offs from the university. So faculty, maybe they had a patent that they were commercializing, some student ventures, and some outside startups. So some mundane things like helping them with their office space and internet connection and whatever. and then also try to help them with their business, networking them to patent attorneys and venture capitalists and things like that. So it was, it was great for me as a young person who was interested in starting my own business. It was a way to be immersed in entrepreneurial climate without actually having to risk any of my own time or money, and kind of get a feel for what I think was working as a startup business and what wasn't working.
Right. Sort of gives you a feel, is this entrepreneurial thing something that I want to be part of or not?
Yeah, well, it certainly took away the mystery, right? So I think a lot of times in life, things seem a lot more mysterious than they really are. And it goes back to that kind of just start, right? Because then the walls come down and you figure it out. So yeah, how do you start a business, and what does it mean to raise capital? Well, I get to sort of see that. And you see the small company across the hall from you, you can put yourself in their shoes. You can visualize yourself doing what they're doing, and it gives you a lot more confidence.
Right. And then soon thereafter, you joined a small startup company.
Yeah. So the great thing about being in that environment is that you're surrounded by entrepreneurs and wannabe entrepreneurs. One of my jobs at the time was to serve as like a judge for a student class where the students had to create like a venture idea and then present at the end of their class. So I was like a judge. At one of those judging events, I met the students who had this idea of creating a fire training technology. That's what ultimately became Bullux, the company that we ran and were pretty successful with.
What made you decide, okay, this is the one?
Yeah.
Right? You saw a lot of companies at the Incubator.
Yeah.
You saw a lot of student presentations. So what was the thing that said, this is the one that I want to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a few things. These guys, I was attracted to this company because I like the team, and this is why I like the team. So actually, it's interesting that the product they had, it was if I explain it quickly, it's a live fire training device, so a piece of equipment, 3x3, it was propane fueled, created flames. And you could use it for simulating a real fire, and you could simulate extinguishing that fire in a safe, clean, and kind of quantitatively assessed way. So I wasn't necessarily sure that was really going to go anywhere or it was a big market, but the team of three guys were impressive, and this is why they're different than almost every other company I ever met. If we met and I presented them with an idea, or they had an idea, or we talked about something to do, the next day it was done, or they'd started on it. So they were actually doing things.
So this is still back, you're at the Incubator.
Yep.
And you would meet with them as the Incubator
Yeah,
guru.
kind of as a mentor
Right.
or something like that.
And so it's in that context that you're saying this.
Yep. So for example, one time they needed a business plan, because lots of reasons to have a business plan, but they wanted to enter the business plan competition. They didn't know where to start. So I said, well, come meet with me and I'll give you some sample business plans. So I did that like at 6:00 at night. And the next morning they came back with a draft. Whereas in many other companies, you talk about something and then the next meeting, whether it's a week later, a month later, and you probably know this, right. Quarter later, nothing really has ever happened.
So they had a bias for action.
Absolutely. So bias for action is a good way to put it. That's number one. Number two is they were laser focused on getting a product to the point where they could sell something. They were even okay with trying to sell something before the product was actually 100% done, as long as they had a pathway to get there. So I mentioned that business plan competition. They won that business plan competition, which at the time, RPI, I think you got $15,000 in cash and some money in in-kind services. They took the $15,000 and they met with myself and some other folks and said, okay, we got $15,000. We want to get a website and kind of do our marketing launch. Like, can you help us? A typical entrepreneur that we work with at the Incubator, if they had $15,000 extra, they would go to a conference or maybe do some more patent research or
work on a technology more.
Something more, right? Their technology.
But nothing to do with sales.
Exactly. They were like, we need to sell this thing and launch it.
Right.
So what can we do for $15,000? And so ultimately they made a video, the product, made a website, and got it launched.
Yeah.
So that was impressive. And then I'm counting. The third thing was I wasn't sure. I know I wasn't sure. I talked to my wife about it, but I just did it.
Took that first step.
Yeah, and actually, if I think about it, I went to a meeting with one of the founders. We went to a marketing company to see what they could do with this $15,000 actually. It was on the 4th floor of some big marketing firm. And we left, and this founder and I got in the elevator, and we pressed, floor 1, and we're going down the elevator. I don't know. I thought for a second, geez, maybe I should tell him I want to join the company. And I just said it. I said, hey, can we meet for coffee? And he looked at me and goes, yeah, why? I'm like, I'm thinking of joining the company. And I knew once I said it, the trains left the station, right?
Right.
So that's kind of how it happened.
You were sort of, if I remember correctly, the 4th person to join, right? There was like 3, I'll use the word original founders just to be descriptive. And then you were sort of the first outsider, I'll use that word.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. So did that present any challenges in itself, or was it just a non-issue?
I don't think it was really a big issue. When I was speaking externally, so I was often doing business development or trying to raise money or whatever, it was a bit of a challenge. How do you explain that you're kind of an owner? I mean, you're an owner, but you're not a founder, and
Yes.
the difference. But internally, no, the 4 of us, so we were all directors. We were the only directors. We had different ownership stake, but we never. I was thinking back on it. In the 10 years we were there, whatever it was, we never voted with our shares, so to speak. We never, no one ever sort of said, hey, I own 10% more than you, so this has to go.
Right.
We did not agree on most things, and we argued it out. Early on in the business, actually, we would meet every Wednesday night from 6 till midnight, just to kind of plan the next week and go through stuff. Production issues, sales issues, marketing issues, whatever. And we would debate back and forth. We would always come to a decision, but it was never based on who owned what. I was thinking back to it. We never played office politics about it.
Yeah. I heard somebody once say that if you're at a meeting of owners and the number of shares have to come up, that's a bad sign.
Yeah.
Right. It's not, the meeting's not going well. Right.
Yeah. It never came up. And we all, we had, I think, one of the strengths of the group, and it goes back to one of the reasons I wanted to join. Everyone was extremely committed, certainly worked really hard, but everyone had different perspectives. They really had different skill sets. One guy was the whiz kid, really the R&D genius. The other person was production, marketing, and sales. Together we made good decisions.
So how did things go at first?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say they were ever bad. It was, early on, of course, cash is king. That's how we measured the business, how much, what our burn rate was, how many days of left we had. We actually had them, in our Wednesday meetings, one of our things on our spreadsheet was we got 13 more days of cash, or we got 6 more days of cash. Oh, now we're up to 28 days of cash. So, it was a little tight. The initial founders, those 3 guys, when they first started, they didn't take a salary at all. When I joined, we started taking salaries, but it was very nominal, kind of just a survival salary. So it was, managing cash and trying to drive sales. We were always pretty much able to stay ahead of the game. Early on, it was just, how do we get from 2 sales a week to 4 sales a week, 4 sales a week to 10 sales a week? And then how do we begin to bring in some extra resources to grow the business? But we were, I think, fortunate in that we got a loan from the local county IDA, fairly low interest loan that helped. And then we won a large regional business plan competition. It's like a $100,000 business plan competition. So that let us hire some extra people. And then, besides that, we just try to manage our cash and always stay ahead of the game.
Did you ever bring in any outside equity?
We didn't in the end. We looked for it. We came up with a business plan and venture pitches, and we did that circuit. We actually got an offer for some investment, but in the end, we didn't take it. So we grew organically, just kept reinvesting the money that we had, kept our expenses low. Yeah, all the way till when we were acquired. We never brought it in outside capital.
Yeah. So what were the biggest challenges in your mind in growing that business?
Absolutely, the biggest challenge is focus. Not be distracted by all of the things that you could do, all the opportunities that are out there. I mean, there are more opportunities than there is time. There are more things to do in a day. You can't get everything done, and so our challenge, on a day-to-day basis, but on a strategic, month to quarter basis, was where do we put our time and energy in our capital?
So how did you make that decision? Right, the phone rings and it's some potential customer saying, "Hey, can you take your product and modify it like this, or can you do this special project for us?" That happens all the time.
Yeah,
in
for
little
sure.
Companies,
And
right?
I was the head of sales, so I want to say yes
Right.
to everything, right?
How did you guys make those decisions and sort through that minefield?
So one thing that we did early on, in the first few months, that I think was very valuable is we went through a strategic planning session amongst the four of us. We got some books I got when I was getting my MBA, and we did some online research on how to do that, and we spent a couple weeks at it, nights, the four of us, five of us. We had another owner that was involved. Figured out who we were and what we wanted to be. So that gave us then a roadmap and some
guidelines,
boundaries to say, okay,
yeah.
is this opportunity within these boundaries or outside these boundaries? So in our case, our company, we developed and manufactured and sold training equipment that was used to simulate emergencies. It could be a fire emergency or a chemical emergency or a military explosive emergency, terrorist emergency, whatever. It would simulate an emergency that would then be used to allow first responders to train on how to deal with that emergency. These were manufactured products, so things you could drop on your foot. They incorporated some kind of technology, and they were designed to simulate that emergency in a better way than the traditional way, or in a cleaner way, or a smarter way. And the end users, again, were first responders, people in emergency services, military, police. So we started out with a fire training device.
So that's what you just described as sort of your first pass filter.
Exactly.
Right? So when the phone rings, it needs to go through that set of criteria you just described. If it comes out the other side of that, you say, okay, let's take a deeper look.
Absolutely, yeah. So our first product was this device which created a live fire that you could use to train on how to use fire extinguishers. So certainly you could think of ways of expanding that product. So larger fires, maybe not just fire extinguishers, but hoses for firefighting, whatever. That was certainly a path we could go in. But our strategy said we're gonna compete in the area of developing training devices that simulate emergencies for first responders. So it didn't need to be necessarily fire. It could be a simulated gas leak. A train that's carrying chlorine gas and leaks. How could we simulate that in a technology way that could allow for training? So once we had that as our roadmap, we then developed products along that line. And the phone, we had an interesting business we set up intentionally in that we sold all of our product directly. So we didn't go through manufacturers, reps, distributors. We had our own internal sales force working in Albany, New York, on the phone, talking to fire chiefs or training officers or guys in the military. And like a lot of industries, but particularly in the fire service, they want to come up with something new, some new idea. Have you ever thought about? So they would tell us, and then that would get funneled up to me and to the R&D guy, and we would vet that.
Right. So eventually you guys sold the business to a larger company.
Going back to that first couple weeks, months, we developed a business plan, and the business plan had key markets we were going to go after.
This is the first couple of months of the business itself.
Business itself, right? Markets we're going to go after, and products and revenue growth and all the things you have in a business plan that would get us to the point where we could be acquired. I think in a typical business plan, you always have to say either be acquired or go public, right? It's kind of what you do. We actually didn't take that business plan off the shelf very often. Maybe we should have done it more often. But we just had our heads down and we were growing the business. And we weren't really even thinking about getting acquired or trying to get acquired. We just trying to grow. And when we got to a certain revenue level, suddenly we started getting on the radar of folks. In our case, it was north of 20 million. Now we were, I don't know, we show up on some private equity.
Somebody's list.
Someone's list now, right? So then we started getting, I'd say once every 2 weeks, once a month, we get a call from a private equity.
So pretty frequently.
It started pretty frequently, yeah. So the private equity guy, they would call and say, hey, I heard about you and I come and see you. And they would come and they would make, the first pitch seemed kind of interesting. And then the 10th one was like exactly the same as the first one. We're focused on, small to mid-sized businesses and all this stuff. So I think that then got us thinking about maybe what it means to sell. We also, I think through those meetings, decided that we weren't interested in selling to a private equity investor or in getting ourselves involved with a private equity investor for a number of reasons. One was the actual multiples that typically we're offering seemed a bit low compared to what we could just generate ourselves. And then the model of those types of investors is to take a business and to increase its value either by cutting costs, growing the earnings, and then making it the multiple make it worth more, or merging it with some other business and making more of a business. Either way, it seemed kind of destructive to our business, which we felt pretty emotional about. All the employees were people that we had brought on. All of them were our friends. We had been growing this business. So it made us think about selling, but made us think about being wary of who we sell to. And then ultimately, we just were approached by a strategic investor that in the end bought the business. And during that process of meeting with the strategic investor, it seemed like the right fit. So we didn't really have a plan to sell it. If we did, we may have done some things a little differently in terms of how we try to drive earnings or how we structured our business model. Ultimately, we just worked hard and got to the point where we were attractive to people in the market.
Yes. So you had a lot of international experience, right?
Yeah.
Backpacking around the world. I mean, that's an international experience. Then you're spending time in Japan, doing various different things. So how important was that international experience at Bullx, at this company we were talking about?
I'm biased. I would say very. It's funny when we look back at the timeline. The company was founded in late 2005. Actually incorporated like December of 2005. Began making sales around then, and I joined right in the beginning of 2006. By 2007, if I think back about the timeline, we were starting to expand sales into England and Australia. And then by 2008, we were in Europe. In 2010, we were building the world's biggest fire training projects in China, in Australia, in the Middle East. So we became international pretty quickly. Maybe we went internationally more quickly than we needed to or should have. I guess because I had some international experience, I'd actually lived overseas for about 10 years total between high school and college and backpacking in Japan. When we had a dozen or so product inquiries on our website from folks in England, I said, okay, let's go take a look and see if people want this product. It wasn't a big deal for me. I didn't think it was a big deal to, ship. It cost like $1,000, ship some equipment over. I got a cheap ticket for $600, rented a car, and drove around the UK for a week doing demos.
You took that first step.
Yeah. I guess for me, it wasn't a big step anymore.
Right.
Maybe for some people, it would have been a big step. For me, it was...
Some people would study the UK market for 12 months.
Yeah, we had people that suggested that, right? We connect with the consulate, and they could do some market analysis and all that.
Connect with the consulate, with their trade guy.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
No, I remember putting the little budget together to talk to the guys about, and I think it was like $2,500 in a week of my time, and I'll drive around the UK, and we'll find out if people want it. And I said, probably I can sell the equipment, which I did, so I didn't have to come home with it.
Didn't have to ship it back.
Yeah, so I think we were profitable like the first week. And that's how we actually entered these markets internationally. We didn't invest in an office or a manufacturing plant or whatever. Every market we started with, so in the UK, for example, after that trip, we then took one of our sales people. We got a UK number online that routed to a number at our office in Albany. We had the person start early, like at 5 a.m, which was 10 a.m. in the UK, so we were kind of within time frame. And she just started selling as if she was in the UK. And once that was going, then it made sense. We got an office, we hired some staff, and we grew. So that was important for sure. And then as we grew the business, we got into larger and larger projects that required, some significant business development work and negotiation. And I think having some international experience, the ability to, listen to people, kind of try to understand what they're saying, what they're looking for, helped in that.
Yeah. Excellent. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Talk about mentors. Have you had any mentors in your life who've helped guide you along this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, they've tended to be my bosses. up to the point where I haven't had bosses. So that's one thing that maybe I miss. But yeah, I had, the key mentors for my business career were yourself. I was at the Incubator, and our common boss, Mike Wacholder, who ran the technology park at RPI. That was, that was key for me. And prior to that, in Japan, actually, outside of business, I had sort of a father figure mentor in Japan that took me under his wing. I met over there. He got me my apartment. He kind of co-sponsored me for that. I ended up doing a little international business with him. We set up a little trading business where we brought some stuff in from Korea. Yeah, he was a mentor and a role model.
So now that you don't have a boss, are you doing any mentoring? Is that something you think about?
Yeah, I only do a little bit. I should do more. So where I have been doing some mentoring is I speak at some classes, so some university type classes, tell my story. I've had several opportunities to speak before alumni groups, from my high school.
Perfect.
So I've enjoyed that. Yeah, it's something I probably should do more of, because typically things aren't as complicated as you think they are. People get paralyzed by the fear of the unknown, and I think a good mentor can sort of try to break down some of those walls, right? Take some of the mystery out, and hopefully do it in a way that the mentee can relate to.
Yes. Things are not as difficult as they seem to be, but they're usually a lot more work than they seem to be.
Yeah, so I learned that from you, and I say that all the time. Absolutely true. And for anyone looking to start a business, I tell them that. It's one of the first things I tell them. And I've met with several people that are interested in starting a business. They want my feedback. And I say that to them. I say, it's not rocket science. I'm assuming rocket science is really hard. It's not rocket science. It's actually not even that complicated. It's just a ton of work. But that's important, because if you're not willing to put in the work, you probably shouldn't get into entrepreneurship. Right.
So one of the things that, as a professor in a business school, that I often get asked this question, so I'd like to get your perspective on it. So students will, upon graduation, say, should I go start a business right away? Right? So should I start this now? Or should I go work for a company for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and then start a business? What are your thoughts on that?
The latter was my experience, and I think that was very valuable. One of the things I think I brought to this team, so the three founders were all college students.
This was their first job, fundamentally.
Yeah, and actually all three of them really have never had a job,
right?
Which also then poses some challenges later, right? Because you're really unemployable. I mean, I'm unemployable now too. When I came into the business, one thing I was able to add was a little bit of perspective to them, but actually more importantly, when we were sort of communicating outside of the business, we were meeting with an investor or a business partner or a bank or a customer, you just sort of have a little bit more gravitas because you've done something, whether it's actually all that good or not.
Right.
You've done that.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of value in that. And then ideally too, you can find work, a career that can build some connections that actually are useful for your entrepreneurial venture. So people that can be your mentors, maybe people that can be your investors, maybe customers of yours. The challenge, of course, is not getting yourself stuck.
Mm-hmm.
When you're young, like when I was backpacking, right, you don't have much to lose. And you're okay eating ramen, right? Your expenses are really low.
Right.
So you got to be careful of that. That's one thing I didn't mention from before. What was the value of backpacking around? I think maybe the biggest value was I learned how to live really cheaply.
Right.
So my $3,000, my budget was $7 a day, all in, which I did. And then when I went to college, it didn't change. I think my budget went down a little bit because I had free food. And then when I got my first job out of college, actually I kept my budget at $100 a week total, which meant when I came back to the U.S. after 4 years, I had a little bit of money.
Sure.
And then even when I was 30 and quit my job to join Book, my personal burn rate wasn't that high.
Right.
And that allowed me to do some things. I think that's also maybe a danger for folks, right?
Yeah. When you live below your means, it gives you a lot of freedom of action. It gives you a lot of freedom to do things that you might want to explore, where when you're spending every penny you bring in, all of a sudden your options are limited.
Yeah, I had people say that to me. Again, they say, "You're such a risk taker. I can't believe it." I said, "No, I'm not. I'm really conservative. I'm really cautious." "Well, you quit your job and you joined this company." And I remember thinking, I talked to my wife about it, and we figure, okay, well, our kids are like 5 and 7. So I've got 11, 12, 13 years before they need to go to college. So I got like a 10 years or more before I need to like have some money. So it's a great time to start.
Right.
Because if it doesn't work, I got 10 more years to go find a real job. I got like nothing to lose. In my mind, I had nothing to lose.
Yes.
But some people don't feel that way.
Right. Well, great. Well, Simon, thank you very much. This was great to hear your story.
Thanks, Bill.
And it's a wonderful story. So thanks again for being part of this.
Yeah, anytime.
Well, hi, Mike. Boy, that was a really great conversation with Simon. What was one of the things that really stuck out with you?
Well, as I mentioned in the intro, Bela, I was fascinated by this idea of being risk averse, yet taking chances with your career. What were your thoughts on that?
So, I see a lot of folks who have lots and lots of ideas, and they do tons of analysis on it, but they never commit to the next step. And I think that was one of the real strong takeaways that I got from my conversation with Simon, was he says that people think of him as being, a risk taker. But he says, no, I'm really not. He goes, what I do is I do a fair amount of planning and analysis, but then I force myself to take the first step or the next step. And he talked about, buying the boat or buying the airplane ticket for his trip around the world after high school. He goes, you just have to start someplace. That, I think, is one of the big takeaways that I got from him.
Yeah, and even if you buy the boat and it doesn't work out, you can sell the boat. It's an asset. And people sometimes forget that if your first step is to buy an asset that has a second best use or a resale value, there's not much of a risk there. And I've talked to a lot of potential entrepreneurs and they've said, oh, I don't know. And yeah, if you're buying a plane ticket, it's got your name on it, you don't use it, it's gone. But there's a lot of things in life where you can buy it, and if it doesn't work out, you can sell it. We teach our 18-year-old freshmen that, both here and we did at Clarkson when I was there, that, hey, it's okay. You can buy that if it's tangible and there's a resale market for. So that's kind of an interesting takeaway. The second thing was when he talked about managing his kind of personal burn rate, right? And he was a little bit thrifty in his life, spent beneath his means. I always tell people my wife and I have our life set up so that we can live on one of our 2 salaries. The second salary is gravy. And if one wants to quit a job and do something different, we can do that. So, it's I think a key to success is if you live thrifty, that gives you the opportunity to do some things if you're kind of overspending. And I realize that different people have different situations, but that is another connection to being kind of financially conservative internally, which gives you then the opportunity to be a little bit less conservative, to take that first step, to buy that boat or buy that plane ticket.
So the other thing, Mike, that I'll say that I took away from this is this notion of that by actually taking that first step, you learn so much more and you get smarter about your journey than you ever can by just studying it more and thinking about it more. And I think that's another great sort of notion of one of the things that Simon talked about, was that you can only plan and analyze so much, and then you get into diminishing returns. And then by actually taking that next step, by actually getting on the airplane and landing it in London and getting off the airplane and having to do something, is really the best way to learn and move your project forward.
Yeah, and it goes back to this idea of, do you need an MBA to be an entrepreneur, or do you need to go to a startup academy or something like that? Sometimes it's just working for another small company. So you're taking a smaller risk for a few years, but seeing life through an entrepreneur's eyes by working for one. That's okay too.
And I think that was one of the things that Simon talked about when he was at the Incubator at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He got to see a whole bunch of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial companies, how they acted, what they did, which ones made a lot of progress, which ones didn't. And so I think that gave him great insight. And remember when he talked about joining this company, because he wasn't a founder, he was like, the 4th person. There was 3 founders and he was the 4th. person to come to that party, he said these guys were special. He could tell that they had a bias for action. They got stuff done, and they were really, really focused on getting a product into the market. Remember, he told that story how they won a business plan competition. And he said most other companies that he's seen in the past would spend that prize money on developing the technology further. But these guys actually spent it on marketing and trying to sell their product. I remember he said, I think it was off the microphone, but he said one of the mottos they had at his business, at Bullex, which was the name of the business, was that nothing good happens until a sale is made. So they were really focused on selling their product. And, the other thing that gets you is it really gets you specific feedback from your customers. Because if they like the product, they're going to tell you what they like about it. And just as importantly, if they have problems with it or they don't like certain things, they're going to tell you about them as well. This notion of nothing good happens until a sale is made is not just a revenue statement. It's not about dollars, but it's also about getting feedback and connected to your customers.
Agreed. People walk with their feet, and you can see what they really believe by how they spend their money. There's a big gap between saying you would buy something in a focus group and actually plunking the money down.
Agreed. The other interesting point that I thought he brought up is lots of times in small companies, the phone rings and either an existing customer or a prospective customer says, hey, could you do this? Which ones of those do you decide to chase and which ones do you not decide to chase? And I see a lot of companies struggle with that because they're excited about, hey, there's a customer interested about doing this and they're willing to pay for it, so we should do it. But at the same time, is it taking it away from their mission? Is it taking away from where they want to go? So I thought it was interesting that he said fairly on, they sat down and they said, okay, we're going to play in this field. And the field is, tools for first responders to be able to deal with situations they may come across that can be used for training. And that was their domain that they were going to play in. And they could use that as sort of their first pass filter when someone showed up on their doorstep and said, hey, can you do this for us? And I think that's another real important lesson for young companies.
Yeah, but I'll push back a little, Bela, as much as I love you. But here's the thing, right? Sometimes you need to know when to pivot away from your original market. So this is really one of those kind of science. Is entrepreneurship a science or an art? This is one of those places where it's definitely art. Sometimes, yeah, you need to stick to the knitting. You need to stay to your focus. You need to have that filter. But if things aren't going as well as you planned, sometimes you do need to say, okay, this is outside our scope, but I think we need to try this. We need to do a small experiment and potentially pivot into this marketplace. So it's one of those things where I've seen success both ways, and I don't think there's one right answer. I think it depends on the situation you're in. How do you like that? Argue a little bit.
Well, I'm not disagreeing with you because, the real answer that all of us professors say is it depends. So you bring up a good point. I remember a comment in one of the other interviews we did where someone said, as an entrepreneur, it's important to be brutally honest with yourself. And if your company is not getting traction, i.e., you're not making sales, you're not making progress, then maybe it's not a distraction. Maybe it's a new opportunity. And there are lots of stories about that, how people chased one way and that it was something that really fell in their lap that turned out to be the thing that made the company great. So your point,
because you were wrong the first time,
exactly.
Right? You were wrong.
Right.
And you say, okay, I was wrong. And my potential customers have helped solve the problem. They've pointed me in the right direction. See, I'm a little ornery today. I told you that earlier and you said, no, you don't sound ornery, but I am. Right. And this is, I think, a really cool insight that, if things are going great and you've got all the work you can handle, sure. Draw that line. Make sure that you focus on your core business because you don't want to upset your existing customer base. But if you aren't hitting your numbers, you need to be looking for these opportunities maybe to pivot and look for some different customer groups. I like this approach.
Excellent point, Mike. Excellent point. I think it's good.
Let me go back to something else and ask you about your opinion, because I love this phrase, bias for action, and the fact that Simon was really attracted to people that had a bias for action. And, I won't say that you're older than me, but you're older than me and you have some more experience, especially in the VC space. I'll also say that you're better looking than I am. So just not to, lower your self-esteem or anything. But how, in your VC experience and as a professor, How do you identify people who have this bias for action? And even more importantly, if you're a young person or you're a person who wants to change careers, how do you develop or learn to have a bias for action?
So it's a great question, Mike. And I know what bias for action looks like, but I'm not sure whether it can be learned or not. And I think there's some individuals I think naturally have a bias for action, i.e. they get stuff done. They're doers, they're not thinkers. And here again, there's a fine line. You got to think about some stuff, some amount, but some individuals, they just get stuff done. Like the example Simon said, right? He sat down with these guys on a Wednesday afternoon or whatever it was. And he said, look, if you want to enter this business plan competition, you need to write a business plan. And the next morning, they had a first draft of the business plan for him. Whereas he said other companies, he'd have that same conversation and it was 2 or 3 weeks before they had a draft. So these guys had a real bias for action.
So rule number 1 is don't be lazy, right? Don't put it off. But I think there's some concrete things we can talk about. I think things like goal setting, right? Set some specific goals that are a push goal for you, but that are in a time frame that is considered short. And then follow through with that. Deliver at least 90% of what you promise when you promise it, or even better, a little bit before, right? So I think goal setting and follow through are 2 things that you can do to improve your bias for action.
And I think they need to be actionable goals, right? With a deliverable, right? Because one goal could be, I'm just going to think about it more. That's not a goal. That's an activity, right? The activity is think about it more. The goal is to actually produce something that's concrete from that time you spent thinking about it, whether it be a document or whatever.
Yeah, SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, actionable. I forget the R, and time oriented, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a good thing, I think, for people to practice is set better goals. Action oriented, fast turnaround, reasonable. I think the second related person is good. Now I've set these goals. How the heck am I going to do this in one day? Ask people to help you and ask for specific tasks, right? Hey, could you help me? Can you do this task by this date? I would really, really appreciate it. And then remember to thank people when they do it. I think a lot of times people don't manage well because either they don't ask people to help them, right, to build something, and then they aren't appreciative after it's done, right? So they won't help you a second time.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, so now we have a couple of concrete kind of action points that I think people can practice.
And I think your notion of engaging and asking other people for their thoughts, ideas, and help is a good one, right? It's very rare that the successful entrepreneur is the lone person sitting in the middle of the woods in a cabin who never interacts with people.
Yeah.
It's typically the opposite, right? It's someone that's very, very much engaged with individuals or industries or markets, whatever. And you're right. I think this notion of setting goals is a good one, where they're sort of actionable goals with sort of concrete deliverables. And they don't have to be huge goals. And I think the other piece that I would add to that, Mike, I think in my own mind, it's better to have 5 or 6 small goals, and I do one each day, than it is to have a big freaking goal that's due in 10 days.
Absolutely.
Because I can sort of measure my progress along the way.
And give yourself positive feedback. There's definitely this idea of breaking big goals into smaller goals, and research shows that that's beneficial. Hey, and I think the last piece of this to wrap this thread up is something that my friend Tim Shagru paraphrased other people. He didn't make this up, but he always insisted on this in me. And don't let perfect get in the way of good, right? So again, with this idea of the business plan, I'm sure that was not a perfect business plan that was delivered overnight to Simon, but it was good. And if they would have tried to turn in a perfect business plan, they would have never gotten it done the next day. So you have to know sometimes perfect is really important. If you're doing brain surgery, perfect is really important, right? There's certain types of tasks where perfect is good, but the vast majority of tasks, good is good enough, good and fast is better than perfect and slow. And in entrepreneurship, where you fail a lot, I think you need to reorient yourself towards getting things done quickly and getting them done at a very good level and not worrying about perfect for things that don't need to be perfect. And I think that can help you with a bias for action as well.
Agreed. Great summary, Mike.
We could do a whole class on this, I think. This is interesting.
Yep. It was a good conversation with Simon. A lot of great takeaways. Hope you all enjoyed the interview with Simon, and you two got some great takeaways. Again, please, if you enjoy the podcast, tell your friends. Give us a nice review in iTunes or whatever system you use for downloading your podcast. We'd like to build our listeners, and the more we have, the better off for everyone. So we appreciate you listening. And until the next time, hope to see you soon. Oh, by the way, let me add one thing. I'm not sure we've ever said this on a podcast, but we do release these one podcast every 2 weeks. That's for now the schedule we're on, and just want to set a level of expectation that every 2 weeks we will release a new episode. So thanks again for listening. Take care, and see you at the next episode.
In 2 weeks. Maybe I won't be so crotchety.
Well, actually, maybe you being crotchety was good, Mike.
I don't know. Maybe we'll get some hostile feedback. That'll be perfect. I'm fired up. All right. Have a good 2 weeks, Bella. I'll see you in a couple.
Thanks, Mike. Take care. Bye.
Bye.